April 12, 1945 dawned gray and cold over the ruined town of Kronach in northern Bavaria, where 10-year-old Klaus Muller crouched behind a pile of rubble that had once been his neighbor's bakery. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the diesel fumes of the American tanks rolling down what remained of Marktplatz. Klaus's hands trembled not from fear, but from rage that burned hotter than any fire the war had brought to his doorstep. The boy had lost everything. His father, a Wehrmacht soldier, had disappeared on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. His older brother Hans had been killed in the defense of Berlin just weeks ago. Their family home was now a crater filled with rainwater and memories. His mother spent her days in the church cellar with the other women, silent and hollow-eyed, while Klaus roamed the streets with the other orphaned children of war. The Americans had arrived 3 days earlier, and Klaus had watched them with burning resentment. These were the men who had bombed his city, who had killed his neighbors, who represented everything the Hitler Youth had taught him to hate. Never mind that the Third Reich had already collapsed, that the Fuhrer was reportedly dead in his bunker in Berlin, that the war was effectively over. To Klaus, these foreign soldiers in their olive-green uniforms were invaders, and he would resist them the only way a 10-year-old boy could. His fingers closed around a jagged piece of concrete roughly the size of his fist. The lead tank had stopped at the intersection, its commander standing in the open hatch, scanning the destroyed buildings with binoculars. The man looked relaxed, almost casual, as if he were surveying farmland rather than a conquered town. This carelessness infuriated Klaus even more. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, Klaus stood up from his hiding place and hurled the rock with all the strength his thin arms could muster. The stone arced through the morning air, tumbling end over end, and struck the tank's turret with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding ruins. The commander's head snapped around instantly. For a frozen moment, Klaus stood exposed in the open, suddenly aware of what he had done. His act of defiance now seemed monumentally stupid. The tank's massive gun could swing toward him. The soldiers could shoot him. Seeing what happened to resistance fighters, their bodies left hanging from lampposts as warnings. But the commander didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he stared directly at Klaus with an expression the boy couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger exactly, though. It wasn't kindness either. It was something else, something that looked almost like recognition, or perhaps sadness. The American raised his hand, and Klaus flinched, expecting the worst. Then the commander did something completely unexpected. He smiled. A genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and motioned for Klaus to stay where he was. He said something to the soldiers below him, then climbed down from the tank with surprising agility. As he approached, Klaus could see he was younger than he'd first appeared. Perhaps in his late 20s, with sandy hair and a face weathered by war, but not hardened by it. The man stopped about 10 feet away and slowly reached into his jacket pocket. Klaus's heart hammered against his ribs. But instead of a weapon, the commander pulled out something round and white, something that gleamed even in the gray morning light. It was a baseball. Lieutenant James Robert Sullivan of the 3rd Armored Division held the baseball in his worn hands as if it were a sacred relic, which in many ways it was. The scuffed leather sphere had traveled with him from Fort Knox through England, across the beaches of Normandy, through the hedgerows of France, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany. It had survived everything the war had thrown at him, and now, standing before this angry German child, it would serve one more purpose. "Easy there, kid," Sullivan said softly, though he knew the boy probably didn't understand English. He held up his free hand in a peaceful gesture, then tossed the baseball gently from one hand to the other. The boy, rail-thin and dressed in clothes that were little more than rags, watched the movement with suspicious eyes. Sullivan understood that look. He'd seen it in the faces of children across Europe, from the bombed-out streets of Cannes to the frozen villages of the Ardennes. It was the look of someone who had learned too young that the world was cruel and that strangers brought only suffering. But Sullivan also knew something the boy didn't. That sometimes, just sometimes, strangers could bring something else. Before the war, James Sullivan had been a high school teacher in Cleveland, Ohio, where he coached the baseball team and taught American history. He remembered his own childhood, growing up during the tail end of the Great Depression, when his father had lost everything in the crash of '29. Baseball had been his salvation, then the crack of the bat, the smell of fresh-cut grass, the simple joy of throwing a ball with friends on long summer evenings. The game had given him purpose when everything else seemed hopeless. This context regarding the therapeutic power of baseball in post-Depression America is drawn from numerous historical accounts of the era, now including those preserved in the Baseball Hall of Fame archives. When Sullivan enlisted in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor, he'd promised himself he wouldn't let the war turn him into something his father wouldn't recognize. He'd seen what combat did to men, how it could hollow them out, leaving only rage and numbness behind. He'd lost friends in Normandy, watched good men die in the Hirchen forest, and killed enemy soldiers whose faces still haunted his dreams. But he'd also made another promise, that if he survived, he would try to be part of the rebuilding, not just the destruction. His baseball had become a symbol of that promise. When his tank crew ribbed him about carrying it everywhere, he would just shrug and say it reminded him of home. But it was more than that. It was a talisman, a piece of his pre-war self that he refused to let the conflict destroy. His commander, Captain Peterson, understood. Peterson had even joked that Sullivan should teach the Germans baseball after they won. Americanize the bastards, he'd said with a laugh. Peterson had died 3 weeks ago during the push through the Ruhr pocket, and Sullivan had inherited command of the tank they'd nicknamed the Cleveland Express. The name was painted on the turret in white letters, and underneath it, Peterson's lucky number, 33. Now facing this German child who had attacked his tank with a rock, Sullivan saw an opportunity to honor both promises to Peterson and to himself. The boy looked to be about 10 or 11, roughly the same age as Sullivan's nephew back home. It's the same age as countless other children on both sides who had been robbed of their innocence by this terrible war. Sullivan crouched down slowly, making himself less threatening. He placed the baseball on the ground between them and rolled it gently toward the boy. It stopped about halfway, rocking slightly on the uneven cobblestones. The child stared at it as if it might explode. "It's okay," Sullivan said gently. "Go ahead. Pick it up." The boy didn't move, his eyes darting between Sullivan and the ball. Behind Sullivan, he could hear his crew climbing out of the tank, curious about what their commander was doing. Sergeant Mike O'Brien, the gunner, approached and stood at Sullivan's shoulder. "Lieutenant, what are you doing?" O'Brien asked in his thick Boston accent. "Teaching," Sullivan replied simply. "Teaching what?" "How to stop a war." O'Brien snorted but didn't interfere. He'd served with Sullivan long enough to trust the man's instincts, even when they seemed crazy. The other crew members, Davidson, the driver, and young Tommy Chen, the loader who joined them as a replacement after DI gathered around, equally confused but willing to wait and see. Klaus, for his part, was utterly bewildered. The American soldiers surrounded him now, but none of them seemed threatening. The leader kept pointing at the strange white ball and making encouraging gestures. Finally, curiosity overcame caution, and Klaus took a tentative step forward. Then another, bent down and picked up the ball. It was heavier than he'd expected, with raised red stitches that formed interesting patterns. The leather was soft and worn, warm from the American's hands. Klaus turned it over, examining it from all angles. He'd never seen anything quite like it. Sullivan grinned and mimed throwing the ball. "Come on," he said. "Throw it back." Klaus Muller had grown up in a Germany where sports meant soccer and calisthenics, where physical education was preparation for military service, where even children's games carried the weight of nationalist ideology. The Hitler Youth had organized his athletics with military precision marching drills, obstacle courses, competitions designed to identify the strongest and most aggressive boys. There had been no joy in it, only duty and the constant pressure to prove oneself worthy of the fatherland. This strange American ball felt different in his hands. It wasn't the familiar hexagonal panels of a football, or the smooth surface of the medicine balls they'd thrown in gymnasium class. The stitching created ridges under his fingers, and he instinctively gripped them, finding that the ball sat naturally in his palm. Sullivan, still crouching, mimed a throwing motion again, this time more exaggerated. He pointed to himself, then made a catching motion with his hands. The message was clear. "Throw the ball to me." Klaus hesitated. Was this some kind of trick? Would they punish him once he complied? But the American's face showed only patient encouragement, and the other soldiers seemed more amused than threatening. Klaus wound up and threw the ball as hard as he could, hoping to startle them or perhaps hit the commander in the face. But Sullivan's hand shot up and snatched the ball from the air with practiced ease. The catch was so smooth, so casual, that Klaus felt a reluctant flicker of admiration despite himself. "Good arm," Sullivan called out, genuinely impressed. The kid had thrown with real force and surprisingly good accuracy. O'Brien whistled low. "Lieutenant, the kid's got heat." Sullivan tossed the ball back to Klaus, who caught it awkwardly against his chest. The commander laughed not mockingly, but with genuine warmth and showed Klaus how to catch properly, forming his hands into a basket shape. Klaus watched carefully, then nodded. When Sullivan threw again, slower this time, Klaus caught it cleanly. Something shifted in that moment. The ball went back and forth between them, American and German, victor and vanquished, man and boy, and, with each throw, the wall of hatred Klaus had built around his heart developed a tiny crack. He wouldn't have admitted it, even to himself, but playing this strange game felt good. It felt like being a child again rather than a soldier without a uniform. Other German children began to emerge from the ruins, drawn by curiosity. They'd been watching from hiding places, ready to scatter if the Americans proved dangerous. But seeing Klaus playing with the foreigners, seeing the soldiers laughing rather than threatening, they crept closer. A girl of perhaps 8 with blonde braids approached first, her hand held by an older boy who might have been her brother, and 2 more boys, both younger than Klaus, ventured into the open. Sullivan noticed the growing audience and had an idea. Called to Davidson, "Go get the gloves from the tank, and that extra ball I've been saving." Davidson, a lanky farm boy from Iowa who'd played semi-pro baseball before the war, grinned and jogged back to the Cleveland Express. He returned moments later with 2 worn baseball gloves and another ball, this one newer and whiter than Sullivan's treasured sphere. The lieutenant gathered the children using gestures and the few German words he'd picked up during the occupation. "Kinder," he said, hoping he was pronouncing it correctly. "Calm, higher. Come here." He arranged them in a rough circle, about 15 feet apart, and distributed the balls. Then he demonstrated the basic throw-and-catch drill, showing them how to grip the ball across the seams, how to step into the throw, how to follow through. The historical record shows that American soldiers frequently used sports and games to bridge cultural divides during the occupation of Germany. As documented in the archives of the United States Army Heritage and Education Center, the children were hesitant at first, glancing at each other uncertainly. But when Klaus threw the first pitch to the little blonde girl and she caught it with a squeal of delight, the ice broke. Soon all the children were throwing, their initial awkwardness giving way to enthusiasm. They laughed when they missed actual laughter, a sound that had been absent from chronic streets for too long. Sullivan's tank crew joined in, each soldier partnering with a child. O'Brien worked with the oldest boy, patiently correcting his throwing motion. Chen, despite being only 19 himself, took charge of the 2 younger boys with the gentle authority of an older brother. Davidson showed the little girl how to snap her wrist for better speed. Klaus found himself paired with Sullivan. And despite his determination to remain cold and distant, he couldn't help but pay attention to the lieutenant's instructions. The American showed him how to grip the ball for a fastball, how to throw a changeup by holding it deeper in his palm, even the basics of a curveball. Though Sullivan warned with a smile that Klaus was too young to throw that pitch seriously, it could hurt his arm. They played for almost an hour, as the morning sun finally burning through the clouds and warming the rubble-strewn square. Other adults began to appear, cautious German civilians who'd been hiding in cellars and churches. They watched in amazement as their children played with the enemy as laughter replaced the sounds of war. Klaus's mother, Maria Muller, emerged from the church and stopped dead at the sight of her son throwing a ball with an American tank commander. Her first instinct was fear. What were they doing to Klaus? But then she saw his face. He was smiling. Her son, who hadn't smiled since his brother's death, who had carried such darkness in his young eyes, was actually smiling. She moved closer, clutching her thin coat around her. Sullivan noticed her approach and understood immediately who she must be. The resemblance was clear, the same sharp cheekbones, the same blue eyes. He walked over, removing his helmet respectfully. "Ma'am," he said, then tried his broken German. Your son? Pointed to Klaus, then gave a thumbs up and smiled. "Gut. Very good. Baseball." Maria didn't understand all the words, but she understood the kindness in this soldier's voice. She nodded slowly, tears suddenly burning in her eyes. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you." 3 days after that first game in the square, Lieutenant James Sullivan made a decision that would raise eyebrows among his fellow officers, but would change everything for the children of Cronac. On April 15, 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, he established what he unofficially called the Cronac Baseball League using a cleared section of bombed-out City Park. The idea had come to him after that first day, when he'd returned to his tank to find Klaus waiting nervously by the treads. The boy had approached with something wrapped in newspaper, a small loaf of dark bread, clearly made from whatever scraps his mother had managed to gather. Klaus had thrust it toward Sullivan without speaking, then turned and fled before the lieutenant could respond. Sullivan had unwrapped the bread carefully and found it was still slightly warm. That evening, he'd shared it with his crew, and they'd all agreed on one thing. If a starving German child was willing to share his food with them, they could do something in return. The next morning, Sullivan had visited the local U.S. Army supply depot and called in every favor he'd accumulated during 3 years of combat. He returned with a box full of treasures, 3 more baseballs, 4 proper gloves, a Louisville Slugger bat that Davidson had been hoarding, and most importantly several cases of rations and chocolate bars. The American brass might have questioned his requisition methods, but Sullivan's combat record bought him considerable leeway. He found Klaus and the other children in the same square, clearly hoping the Americans would return. This time, Sullivan came prepared. Through a German-speaking chaplain named Father Heinrich, who'd attached himself to the 3rd Armored Division, Sullivan proposed a deal. Daily baseball practice in exchange for helping rebuild the park and attending makeshift school sessions that Father Heinrich would organize. Klaus translated for the younger children. His English surprisingly functional, a remnant of grammar school before the war had consumed everything. "He wants us to play this baseball every day," Klaus explained, his tone skeptical. "But we must also study and work. It is ... a trade." The children looked at each other uncertainly. Several adults had gathered as well, including Maria Muller and Herr Weber, the former schoolteacher who'd lost his left leg in the First War, and his son in this one. The old man stepped forward, leaning heavily on his crutch. "What is the point?" Weber asked in heavily accented English. "We have lost. You have won. Why do you care if our children play games or study lessons? Noon you will leave and we will starve, and none of this will matter." Sullivan met the old man's bitter gaze steadily. "You're right that we won," he said as Father Heinrich translated. "But here's what I learned about winning. If all we do is defeat you and walk away, we haven't won anything except the next war. My father fought in France in 1918. He came home and watched Germany fall apart, watched the anger grow, and you know what he told me when I enlisted? He said, 'Make sure you finish the job right this time.'" The lieutenant paused, choosing his next words carefully. These kids didn't start this war. Hell, some of them weren't even born when it started. They deserve a chance to be children again, to learn something besides hate and fear. That's what the baseball is about. Not just a game, but remembering how to play, how to be part of something bigger than themselves, without it being about killing. According to records from the U.S. Army Civil Affairs Division, similar recreational and educational programs were implemented throughout occupied Germany as part of early denazification efforts, though most were not officially sanctioned until later in 19... Weber stared at Sullivan for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You are either very naive or very wise, Lieutenant. I have not decided which, but I will help with the school." "These children need education more than baseball. They need both," Sullivan replied. "And so do we. My men need to remember they're human too, not just soldiers." And so the Cronac Baseball League was born. Every morning at 9 o'clock, weather permitting, the children would gather in the cleared section of park that Sullivan's crew and German volunteers had meticulously swept for unexploded ordnance and debris. Father Heinrich and Herr Weber conducted lessons in reading, mathematics, and history from 9 to 11, carefully avoiding any mention of Nazi ideology and instead focusing on classical German literature and basic skills. From 11 to noon, the children helped with reconstruction work, clearing rubble, salvaging useful materials, and beginning to plant vegetables in what had once been the park's flower gardens. Sullivan had arranged for seeds and tools from the military government supplies, arguing that a stable food source would prevent unrest. Then came the part everyone looked forward to. From noon until 2 o'clock, they played baseball. Klaus proved to be a natural athlete, and more importantly, a natural leader. His initial hostility had transformed into intense focus, and he threw himself into learning the game with the same determination he'd once applied to Hitler youth training. But where those exercises had been about aggression and dominance, baseball taught different lessons: teamwork, patience, and the acceptance of failure as part of learning. Sullivan worked with Klaus personally, teaching him not just the mechanics of pitching, but the strategy behind it. "Baseball is like chess," the lieutenant explained one afternoon. They sat in the shade of a partially destroyed wall, sharing a canteen of water. "You have to think ahead. What is the batter expecting? What pitch did you throw last time? How can you surprise him?" Klaus absorbed everything, his quick mind engaged in a way it hadn't been since before the war. "It is like tactics," he said thoughtfully.
Right.
"Like my father described knowing what the enemy expects and doing something else." Sullivan winced slightly at the word enemy, but nodded. "Exactly like that. Except here the enemy is your teammate tomorrow. It's important, Klaus. Today's opponent is tomorrow's friend. Can you teach that to the other kids?" Klaus considered this, then asked quietly, "Were you afraid? When you fought?" "Every day," Sullivan admitted honestly. "Any soldier who says he wasn't afraid is either lying or crazy. But you know what got me through? Remembering what I was fighting for? It's not against something that's just hate, and hate makes you stupid. But for something, home, family, the idea that maybe kids like you and kids like my nephew back in Cleveland could grow up in a world that wasn't always at war. Your nephew plays baseball? Best shortstop in his little league?" Sullivan said with a grin. 12 years old and already getting noticed by scouts. His name's James to Jimmy. We named him after me and my grandfather." Klaus was quiet for a moment. "My brother was also named for our grandfather. Hans Wilhelm, like my Grovator who died in the First War. Everyone said Hans looked like him. You miss him," Sullivan said softly. It wasn't a question. "Every day," Klaus whispered. They sat together in companionable silence, two people from different worlds united by loss and the strange hope of a leather ball. By late April 1945, as Germany officially surrendered and the world began the long process of reckoning with the Holocaust's horrors and the war's devastation, something unexpected was happening in Chronic. The baseball league had grown from 8 children to nearly 40, and word had spread to neighboring towns where American units were stationed. Captain Douglas McIntyre of the 45th Infantry Division, stationed 15 miles away in Kulmbach, heard about Sullivan's experiment from a Stars and Stripes correspondent who'd passed through the area. McIntyre, a pre-war minor league player from Birmingham, Alabama, immediately drove to Cronach to see for himself. He arrived on April 27th to find a genuine baseball diamond roughly laid out in the park. The bases were pieces of canvas stretched over wooden frames. The pitcher's mound was a raised platform of compacted rubble. Home plate was a piece of metal shaped approximately like a pentagon. But the children playing on it treated it like Yankee Stadium. Klaus stood on the mound, his form remarkably polished for someone who'd learned the game only 2 weeks earlier. He wound up and delivered a fastball that popped into Davidson's borrowed catcher's mitt with authority. The young German boy at bat, a kid named Friedrich, who'd lost his parents in the bombing, swung late and missed. "Strike 3, O'Brien called from his position as umpire, and Klaus pumped his fist in triumph. McIntyre watched for an hour, increasingly impressed. These weren't just kids playing catch. They were playing actual baseball with remarkable competence. Sullivan had taught them the rules, the positions, and more importantly, the spirit of the game. When a girl named Greta dropped an easy fly ball in right field, her teammates didn't berate her but called out encouragement. When the smallest boy, 6-year-old Dieter, finally made contact and dribbled a ball toward third base, everyone cheered as if he'd hit a home run. After the game, McIntyre approached Sullivan. "Lieutenant, this is something special you've got here." "Thank you, sir. I've got a proposition for you. We've started something similar in Kulmbach, not as organized as this, but we've got about 30 kids learning the game. What would you say to a tournament? Your best players against ours. End of May, before our units ship out. Give these kids something to look forward to, something to work toward." Sullivan's face lit up. "That would be incredible, sir. But we'd need permission from Division Command, and we'd need transportation." "Already thought of that," McIntyre interrupted. "I've got a friend in civil affairs who owes me several favors. We can frame it as a morale operation and cultural outreach. Brass loves that kind of thing for the newsreel shows. We're winning hearts and minds. We can get trucks to transport the kids, maybe even scrounge up some proper equipment from surplus supplies. The proposal electrified Cronach. When Sullivan announced the tournament through Klaus's translation, the children erupted in excitement. Even the adults caught the fever. Herr Weber, who'd remained skeptical about the entire baseball enterprise, found himself helping to coach and drill the children on fundamentals. Maria Muller and other mothers began sewing crude but serviceable uniforms from repurposed military canvas and dyed bedsheets. The team needed a name. Sullivan gathered the children and opened it for discussion. Suggestions flew. The Cronach Eagles, the Thunder Boys, the Bavarian Bombers, quickly vetoed by Sullivan for obvious reasons. Finally, Klaus stood up. "We should be the Phoenix," he said firmly. "The bird that burns and is reborn from ashes. That is us. That is Cronach." The vote was unanimous. The Cronach Phoenix would face the Kulmbach Tigers on May 20th. The 3 weeks of preparation transformed the town as the baseball field became the center of community life. Practices grew more intense, but never lost their joy. Sullivan brought in other soldiers from his division to help us. Sergeant from Brooklyn, who'd played semi-pro, taught the kids how to slide into bases. A corporal from Texas, who'd been a high school coach, worked on their bunting. Davidson focused on developing their batting eyes and plate discipline. Klaus emerged as the clear ace of the pitching staff, but he wasn't alone. A 13-year-old named Johann, whose father had been a butcher before the war, discovered he had a natural sinker that made batters pound balls into the ground. Greta, the girl who'd initially struggled in the outfield, developed into a reliable center fielder with surprising speed. But the real breakthrough came with Peter Steiner, a 12-year-old boy who'd been so traumatized by witnessing his home's destruction that he'd barely spoken since the Americans arrived. Sullivan had been working with him patiently, never pushing, just including him in the activities. One afternoon, Peter stepped up to bat during practice and did something unexpected. He smiled. Then he hit Sullivan's pitch so hard that the ball sailed over the improvised left field fence and disappeared into the rubble beyond. Peter stood frozen at home plate, stunned by what he'd done. Then Klaus let out a whoop, and suddenly everyone was cheering, mobbing Peter, celebrating not just the home run, but his return to the living world. After practice, Peter approached Sullivan shyly. "Herr Lieutenant," he said quietly in German, which Klaus translated, "I want to say thank you. When I hit that ball, I felt like I was alive again, like everything might be okay someday." Sullivan had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. When he turned back, he crouched down to Peter's level. "Baseball's funny that way," he said. "Sometimes it can do what words can't. You're going to be fine, Peter. All of you are going to be fine." But even as the tournament approached and excitement built, reality intruded. On May 8th, Germany officially surrendered unconditionally. VA Day was celebrated by Allied forces throughout Europe, but for the Germans of Cronach, it was a day of mixed emotions, relief that the dying had stopped, but also grief and shame at what their country had done and become. Sullivan gave the children the day off from baseball. It felt inappropriate to play games while everyone processed the war's official end. But the next morning, Klaus appeared at the field before anyone else, carrying a ball and wearing the makeshift uniform his mother had sewn. When Sullivan arrived, he found the boy throwing against a wall, practicing his mechanics with grim determination. "Klaus," Sullivan said gently, "you okay?" The boy didn't stop throwing. "The war is over. Germany lost. Everything my father and brother died for was a lie. Everything I was taught was lies." His voice cracked. What am I supposed to do with that?" Sullivan let the question hang for a moment, then picked up a glove. "You're supposed to throw strikes. The tournament is in 12 days. Your team is counting on you." "That's not a lie, Klaus. That's real." Klaus finally stopped and turned to face the lieutenant, tears streaming down his face. "How can you be so kind to us after everything?" "Because you're not everything," Sullivan said simply. "You're one boy who lost his father and brother. You're one kid who deserves a chance to be something other than what the war tried to make you. That's not kindness, Klaus. That's just remembering that you're human. And so am I." Klaus nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Then he wound up and threw the hardest pitch of his life straight into Sullivan's waiting glove. May 20th, 1945 arrived with perfect spring weather, warm sunshine. Gentle breeze, not a cloud in the crystalline Bavarian sky. By 7 o'clock in the morning, 3 U.S. Army Dusonderhof trucks sat idling in Kronach's main square, their engines rumbling with promise. The Kronach Phoenix had assembled in full uniform, canvas jerseys with Phoenix sewn across the chest in red thread, mismatched pants, and whatever shoes the children owned that were sturdy enough for running. Klaus wore his brother's old boots, carefully repaired by his mother. Around his neck hung a small silver cross that had belonged to Hans Maria, had given it to him the night before, telling him through tears that his brother would have been proud. The weight of it against his chest felt both comforting and crushing. The entire town turned out to see them off. Nearly 200 people crowded the square, more civilians than Sullivan had seen together at once since his unit arrived. Herr Weber made a short speech, his voice thick with emotion, about how the Phoenix represented hope for all of them. Maria Muller hugged Klaus fiercely, whispering in his ear, "Win or lose, you have already been victorious. You are living again." Father Heinrich offered a brief blessing, carefully non-denominational to avoid any hint of the Reich's religious complications. Then Sullivan climbed onto the lead truck's running board and addressed the assembled crowd in his broken German, with Klaus translating the parts he missed. "People of Kronach, 3 weeks ago, your children and my soldiers were enemies. Today, they are teammates. Tomorrow, they'll compete against other German children who've learned this American game. But win or lose, what matters is that they're playing, not hating, but playing together. That's how we build a better world. It's one game at a time." The convoy rolled out at 8 o'clock, heading west toward Kulmbach. Sullivan rode in the cab of the lead truck with Klaus beside him, while Davidson drove and O'Brien dozed in the back with the other children. The route took them through countryside that bore the scars of war-burned-out vehicles rusting in ditches, damaged bridges hastily repaired by Army engineers, farm fields pockmarked with shell craters. But spring was reclaiming the land. Wildflowers grew in the bomb craters. New grass covered the tank tracks. Birds sang in trees that had somehow survived the artillery. Klaus watched it all silently, absorbing the strange contradiction of beauty and destruction coexisting. "My father brought me this way once," Klaus said suddenly. "Before the war, we visited Kulmbach for their beer festival. I was very young, maybe 5. I remember he bought me marzipan shaped like little animals. I had a pig and a bear." Sullivan glanced at the boy. Klaus rarely spoke about his father directly. Sounds like a good memory. "It was he carried me on his shoulders when I got tired walking. I could see everything from up there. The whole world seemed smaller, less scary." Klaus paused. "Do you think he would understand what we're doing today? Or would he think I was a traitor?" The question hung heavy in the cab. Davidson shifted uncomfortably in the driver's seat. Sullivan took his time answering. "Klaus, I never met your father, but I'll tell you what I think. Any father worth remembering would want his son to live, to have a future, to find joy again. The people who'd call you a traitor are the same ones who sent children to die for their lies. Your father was a soldier who followed orders in a war he probably didn't fully understand. You're a boy learning to live in peace. Those aren't the same thing. But he died believing in Germany." "Maybe he died believing in you," Sullivan countered. "Fathers do that. They tell themselves they're fighting for the fatherland or flag or whatever, but really, they're fighting to protect the people they love. And that's what my dad told me when I enlisted. He didn't care about democracy or freedom in the abstract. He cared about me coming home. Your father probably felt the same way." Klaus absorbed this quietly. After several minutes, he said, "I hope you're right." They arrived in Kulmbach at 10:30. The town was larger than Kronach and had suffered less damage, though it too bore the war's marks. Captain McIntyre met them at what had once been the town's athletic field, now converted into a proper baseball diamond with help from Army engineers. Real bases had been installed. A backstop of chicken wire stood behind home plate. Bleachers salvaged from a bombed school gymnasium provided seating. The Kulmbach Tigers were already there, warming up. They looked formidable, slightly older on average, with access to better equipment, thanks to their town's more intact supply lines. Their leader was a tall, athletic 14-year-old named Ernst, whose father had been a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Britain in 1940. The historical significance of these youth baseball leagues in occupied Germany has been documented in several academic studies of post-war reconstruction, particularly in Dr. Margaret Stevens' book America's Cultural Offensive, Sports and Democracy in Post-War Europe. As the Kronach children climbed down from the trucks, the two groups of German kids sized each other up. There was no hostility exactly, but definitely wariness. Then Ernst stepped forward and extended his hand to Klaus. "Welcome to Kulmbach," he said formally. "May we have a good game?" Klaus shook his hand, matching Ernst's firm grip. "The Phoenix is honored to be here." The formality broke. Suddenly the children were chattering excitedly about pitching grips and batting stances, comparing uniforms and equipment, united by their shared love of this strange American game. Sullivan and McIntyre exchanged satisfied looks. "You've done something special here, Jim," McIntyre said. "We both have," Sullivan replied. "Let's give them a game they'll remember." The first pitch was scheduled for noon. As the morning wore on, more spectators arrived, American soldiers from various units stationed nearby, German civilians from Kulmbach, even a few French forced laborers who'd been liberated weeks earlier and were awaiting transport home. By game time, nearly 500 people surrounded the field, the largest gathering of Germans and Americans together since the occupation began. Stars and Stripes correspondent Corporal Eddie Brennan arrived with a camera, officially documenting what he called the first step toward reconciliation. He interviewed Sullivan before the game, asking what inspired the tournament. "Corporal, I spent 3 years learning how to destroy things," Sullivan said, choosing his words carefully. "Seems like I should spend at least 3 weeks learning how to build them back up. These kids are going to inherit whatever world we leave them. Might as well make it one where former enemies can play ball together." Brennan scribbled furiously in his notebook. "That's going to make a hell of a headline, Lieutenant." At 11:45, Sullivan gathered the Kronach Phoenix for a final talk. They huddled near the third base dugout, really just a long bench under a makeshift canvas, awning their faces a mixture of excitement and nerves. "All right, listen up," Sullivan said, with Klaus translating for the younger children. "You've worked hard for this. You've learned not just a game, but what it means to be part of a team. The Tigers are good, maybe better than us in some ways. They've had more resources, more time with proper equipment. But you know what they don't have?" He paused, looking at each child in turn. "They don't have Klaus's fastball. They don't have Greta's speed in center field. They don't have Peter's power. They don't have your heart, your determination, your story of coming back from nothing. You're not just a baseball team. You're living proof that people can survive anything and still find joy. So go out there and play your game. Win or lose, you've already proven something more important than any score." Klaus stepped forward. "Coach Sullivan," he said. It was the first time he'd used the word coach. "We want to say thank you. All of us. You taught us more than baseball. You taught us that not all Americans are enemies, that not all Germans are Nazis, that maybe the world can be different than what we learned." The other children nodded enthusiastically. Little Greta, who'd been so shy at first, spoke up in her small voice. "My mother says you are like a saint, Herr Sullivan. She says you saved us." Sullivan felt his throat tighten. "I'm no saint, Greta. Just a teacher who remembered why he became a teacher in the first place. Now come on, we've got a game to play." They took the field to scattered applause from both German and American spectators. Klaus walked to the pitcher's mound with his head held high, Hans's cross gleaming in the sunlight. He threw his warm-up pitches with focused intensity, each one a statement of intent. Captain McIntyre stood at home plate with a megaphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, soldiers and civilians, welcome to the first annual Bavarian Youth Baseball Championship." His announcement drew cheers and laughter. "Today's game features the Kronach Phoenix versus the Kulmbach Tigers. Play ball." Ernst, the Tigers' captain, stepped into the batter's box for the top of the first inning. Klaus wound up and delivered his first competitive pitch of fastball that caught the outside corner perfectly. "Strike one," called the umpire, a master sergeant from Chicago who'd played college ball. The game had begun. The first 3 innings of the game on May 20th unfolded like a masterclass in tension. Klaus pitched with the fierce concentration of someone channeling every emotion he'd felt over the past month: grief, anger, hope, and determination into each throw. His fastball popped into the catcher's mitt with authority, and his changeup, Sullivan had spent hours teaching him, kept the Tigers' batters off balance. Ernst proved to be a formidable opponent at the plate. In his first at-bat, he'd watched Klaus's fastball for a strike. then fouled off 3 straight pitches before finally grounding out to second base. As he jogged back to the dugout, he'd nodded respectfully at Klaus, a Warrior's acknowledgement of a worthy adversary. The Phoenix drew first blood in the bottom of the second inning. Friedrich, the orphan boy who'd lost both parents, worked a walk on a full count. Klaus sacrificed him to second with a perfect bunt that he'd practiced hundreds of times under Davidson's patient instruction. Then Peter Steiner, the traumatized boy who'd barely spoken for weeks, stepped to the plate. The Tigers' pitcher, a lanky boy named Wilhelm, threw a fastball that Peter met with a swing of pure instinct. The crack of bat-meeting ball echoed across the field like a gunshot, and for a moment, everyone froze. Then the ball was sailing, soaring over the left fielder's desperate leap, clearing the makeshift fence and landing in a pile of rubble 50 feet beyond. Peter stood at home plate, stunned, until Klaus grabbed his arm and shouted, "Run!
Run!"
Then Peter was flying around the bases, his face transformed by pure joy, while the crowd erupted. Friedrich crossed home plate, and Peter followed moments later to a hero's welcome from his teammates. Phoenix 2, Tigers 0. But the Tigers weren't finished. In the top of the third, Ernst led off with a sharp single to right field. The next batter bunted him to second. Clearly McIntyre had been teaching the same fundamentals as Sullivan. Then their cleanup hitter, a stocky boy named Franz, who looked like he'd been built for rugby rather than baseball, drove a pitch deep to center field. Greta, playing shallow, turned and ran. She'd learned to judge fly balls through countless hours of practice, learning to overcome her initial fear of the ball. She sprinted back, her eyes locked on the descending white sphere against the blue sky. At the last possible moment, she dove, fully extending her body, caught the ball in her outstretched glove just before it hit the ground. The crowd went wild. Even some of the Tigers supporters applauded the spectacular catch. Ernst, who'd tagged up and advanced to third, shook his head in admiration as he dusted himself off. Sullivan, coaching third base for the Phoenix, caught Greta's eye as she jogged back to her position and gave her a thumbs up. She beamed with pride. The game remained 2-0 through 5 innings, with Klaus dominating on the mound and the Tigers' Wilhelm matching him in grit, if not polish. Every pitch mattered. Every at-bat carried weight. The children played with an intensity that belied their ages, as if this game represented something far more important than a simple contest. In the top of the 6th inning, disaster struck. Klaus, who'd thrown nearly 80 pitches already, started to tire. Ernst led off and worked the count full before lining a single to left. The next batter sacrificed him to second. Then Franz stepped up again. Sullivan called time and walked to the mound. Klaus's face was flushed, his arm hanging heavy at his side. "I can finish," Klaus said immediately. "Don't take me out, Klaus. You've thrown your heart out there. You've got nothing to prove. I need to finish, coach. Please." Sullivan studied the boy's face and saw not just determination, but something else: a need for closure, for completion. 8. He nodded slowly. "One more batter. But if he gets on base, I'm bringing in Johann." Klaus nodded and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He wound up and threw a fastball that Franz fouled off. The second pitch was outside ball 1. The third pitch was another fastball that Franz met solidly, sending a line drive toward the gap in right center field. But Johann, playing right field, had been positioned perfectly. He charged the ball, fielded it cleanly on one hop, and fired a strike to second base to hold Ernst at third. Klaus escaped the inning without damage, but Sullivan could see he was finished. In the bottom of the 6th, with the Phoenix still clinging to their 2-run lead, Sullivan made the pitching change. Klaus handed the ball to Johann with quiet dignity, then moved to shortstop. If this were his last inning on the mound, at least he'd kept his team ahead. Johann's sinker ball induced 3 straight ground balls, 2 to Klaus at short, who handled both flawlessly, and 1 to second base. The Phoenix had 6 more outs to preserve their lead. The top of the 7th, the final inning, in their shortened game format, began with the Tigers' heart of the order, due up. The tension in the crowd was palpable. German mothers clutched their children. American soldiers leaned forward on the bleachers. Even Corporal Brennan had stopped taking notes and was simply watching, captivated. The Tigers' first batter singled. The second batter sacrificed him to second good fundamental baseball that McIntyre had clearly drilled into them. 2 outs, runner on second, and Ernst stepping to the plate. This was the moment both teams had been building toward, their best hitter against a tired pitcher with everything on the line. Sullivan considered walking Ernst intentionally, but decided against it. These children deserved to settle this fairly, without gamesmanship. Johann went into his windup and delivered his signature sinker. Ernst swung and topped it, sending a slow roller toward third base. The Phoenix third baseman, a 9-year-old named Lucas, who'd been steady all game, charged the ball. He fielded it cleanly, set his feet, and threw across the diamond. Time seemed to slow. The ball arced through the air, sprinted down the first base line, his long legs eating up the distance. The first baseman stretched, his glove extended. The ball and Ernst arrived simultaneously. Out. The umpire shouted, and the Phoenix exploded in celebration. They'd won. The Kronach Phoenix, a team that hadn't existed a month ago, composed of children who'd lost everything, had defeated the Kulmbach Tigers 2-0 in front of 500 spectators on a perfect May afternoon in a Germany trying to find its way forward. Klaus stood at shortstop, tears streaming down his face, but this time they were tears of joy. His teammates mobbed him, and Sullivan fought his way through the celebration to embrace the boy who'd thrown a rock at his tank just 5 weeks earlier. "You did it," Sullivan said. "You all did it." "No, coach," Klaus replied, his voice choked with emotion. "We did it, all of us. It's Germans and Americans. Together." The celebration that followed the game transcended sport and became something closer to a revival. American soldiers and German civilians mingled freely for the first time since the occupation began, united by their shared witness to something beautiful and improbable. The children of both teams, natural allies, despite the manufactured divisions of war, compared notes on technique and laughed together over missed plays and spectacular catches. Captain McIntyre found Sullivan near the makeshift dugout and clasped his hand firmly. "That was extraordinary, Jim. Truly extraordinary. I've been in 3 campaigns, seen men do incredibly brave things, but I think what you've done here might outlast all of it." Sullivan shook his head modestly. "It's just baseball, Doug." "No," McIntyre insisted. "It's the opposite of everything this war was about. For 4 years people taught ourselves to see the enemy as something less than human. It's made it easier to kill them that way. But these kids," he gestured toward the field where Klaus and Ernst were demonstrating pitching grips to each other, "they're learning the opposite lesson. That the enemy is just another kid who likes the same game, feels the same emotions, bleeds the same blood." Corporal Brennan approached with his camera. "Lieutenant Sullivan, can we get a photograph? Both teams together, maybe with you and Captain McIntyre?" They assembled on the pitcher's mound, all 24 children from both teams, flanked by Sullivan, McIntyre, and several other American coaches. Klaus stood in the front row, still wearing his brother's boots and cross, holding the game ball that the umpire had given him as the winning pitcher. Ernst stood beside him, one hand on Klaus's shoulder, in a gesture of sportsmanship that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. "Everyone say baseball," Brennan called out. "Baseball," he chorused, and the shutter clicked. That photograph would eventually appear in stars and stripes under the headline, "From Enemies to Teammates. Baseball bridges the gap in occupied Bavaria." It would be reprinted in newspapers across America, and decades later it would hang in the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, as a testament to the game's power to heal. But in that moment, it was simply 24 children smiling for a camera, grateful to be alive and together. After the photograph, the Americans broke out their surprise. Boxes of hot dogs and buns, smuggled from the post exchange and heated over portable field stoves. Most of the German children had never tasted hot dogs before. Sullivan demonstrated the proper technique mustered, a little relish if available, eaten in enthusiastic bites while discussing the game. Klaus bit into his first hot dog cautiously, then his eyes widened. "This is what Americans eat at baseball games." "Every single one," Davidson confirmed with a grin. "Hot dogs, peanuts, and Cracker Jack. It's tradition." "I like American traditions," Klaus decided, taking another large bite. As the afternoon wore on, an impromptu second game developed, a mixed exhibition match with Tigers and Phoenix players on the same teams, Americans playing alongside Germans. The competitiveness evaporated, replaced by pure joy. When Ernst pitched to Sullivan and struck him out on 3 straight sinkers, the entire field erupted in laughter as the lieutenant pretended to argue with the umpire. Maria Muller, who'd made the journey to Kulmbach in a separate truck with other Kronach parents, watched her son play with tears streaming down her face. Father Heinrich, standing beside her, put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Your son has found his way back," the priest observed quietly. "I wasn't sure he would." "I wasn't either," Maria admitted. "After Hans died, Klaus became so hard, so angry. I thought I'd lost both my boys. But then that American came with his baseball, ... Double quotes. She shook her head in wonder. How does a game heal? What war breaks? Perhaps because games remind us what it means to play rather than fight, Father Heinrich suggested. To compete without killing. To learn that losing doesn't mean death, and winning doesn't require someone else's destruction. These are not small lessons in a world that's forgotten them. As evening approached, Sullivan reluctantly announced it was time to head back to Kronach. The children protested. Couldn't they stay just a bit longer? But the convoy needed to return before dark, and tomorrow both teams had school and work details. The teams exchanged addresses, promising to write to each other. Ernst and Klaus clasped hands one final time. "We'll have a rematch," Ernst declared. "Next month. The Tigers will win." "The Phoenix will be ready," Klaus replied with a grin. As the trucks pulled away from Kulmbach, the children waved until the town disappeared from view. Then they settled in for the return journey, many of them falling asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the emotional and physical intensity of the day. Klaus remained awake, sitting beside Sullivan in the lead truck's cab once again. He was quiet for the first few miles, turning the game ball over and over in his hands. "Coach Sullivan," he finally said, "what happens when you leave? When your division ships out?" It was the question Sullivan had been dreading. His unit's departure orders had come through that morning. The 3rd Armored would be heading to occupied Austria within 2 weeks, then gradually demobilizing as soldiers rotated home based on their service points. Sullivan had enough points to go home by July, maybe sooner. "I don't know exactly when," Sullivan admitted. "Soon, though. The war's over. They need us elsewhere. And eventually they don't need us at all. It's a good thing, Klaus. It means the peace is holding. But who will coach the team? Who will make sure we don't forget?" Sullivan reached over and tapped the game ball. "That's on you now. You and Ernst and all the other kids who learned to play, you're the coaches for the next group. You teach the younger kids what I taught you, not just how to throw a curveball, but why the game matters. Can you do that?" Klaus was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I think so. Yes, I can do that. I know you can. You're going to be fine, Klaus. All of you are going to be fine." But as the truck rolled through the darkening countryside toward Kronach, Sullivan felt a profound sadness settling over him. He'd been telling the truth the children would be fine. They'd already proven they could survive anything. But leaving them felt like abandoning a job half-finished, a story without its final chapter. They arrived back in Kronach well after dark. The town had hung lanterns in the square, and despite the late hour, hundreds of people waited to welcome the team home. When Klaus stepped down from the truck holding the game ball aloft, the crowd erupted in cheers. Herr Weber pushed his way forward on his crutch, his weathered face split by an enormous smile. "You won." "The whole town heard on the radio that you won." "There was radio coverage," Sullivan asked, surprised. "The Americans broadcast it on the Armed Forces Network," Weber explained. "Everyone with a working radio listened." "You've made us proud, Klaus. Made all of Kronach proud." Maria embraced her son, holding him tight. "Your father would have been proud," she whispered. "Your brother, too." Klaus, exhausted and overwhelmed, could only nod. He looked for Sullivan in the crowd and found the lieutenant watching the reunion with an expression of deep satisfaction, mixed with melancholy. Their eyes met across the square, and Klaus understood. This was the beginning of goodbye. The American who'd taught him baseball, who'd shown him that former enemies could become friends, who'd helped him find his way back from the darkness. This man wouldn't be here forever, but the lesson would remain. The game would continue. Somehow, that would have to be enough. June 5th, 1945, arrived with unseasonable cold and persistent rain. that turned the baseball field into a muddy quagmire. Sullivan stood at home plate anyway, wearing his poncho and watching Klaus throw in the outfield to stay warm. The boy's mechanics had become second nature, now the fluid windup, explosive drive off the back leg, the snap of the wrist at release. He no longer looked like a child playing at baseball. He looked like a ball player. The orders had been finalized. 3rd Armored Division would begin its move to Austria on June 8th, 3 days away. Sullivan had delayed telling the children as long as possible, but today was the day. I deserved time to process it, time to say goodbye properly. The team arrived for practice one by one, dressed in rain gear made from repurposed military canvas. They'd been practicing in worse weather than this for weeks now, determined to maintain their edge for the promised rematch against Kulmbach. No one wanted to give up their momentum from the victory. When everyone had assembled, Sullivan called them together under the canvas shelter that served as their dugout. 23 faces looked at him expectantly. They'd grown from the original 8. Children to include newcomers who'd heard about the team and wanted to join. The Phoenix had become the center of youth life in Chronic, a symbol of renewal that transcended baseball. "We need to talk," Sullivan began, and immediately the children sensed something was wrong. Klaus's face went very still. "My division received orders. We're shipping out to Austria in 3 days. After that, I'll eventually be heading home to America. Why, war is over." The silence was absolute, except for the steady drumming of rain on canvas. Little Greta began to cry softly. Friedrich stared at the ground. Peter, the traumatized boy who'd been brought back to life by baseball, looked like he might retreat into his shell again. Klaus stood abruptly, his jaw clenched. "How long have you known?" "The orders came through 2 days ago," Sullivan admitted. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but you didn't want to deal with us being sad." Klaus's voice was sharp, angry. He didn't want it to be difficult. "Klaus, no," the boy's voice cracked. "You taught us to trust you. You taught us that Americans could be different. And now you're just leaving like none of this mattered." Sullivan felt the accusation like a physical blow. "It matters, Klaus. It matters more than almost anything I've done in this war. But I'm a soldier. I have orders. I can't stay, no matter how much I might want to." "Then you're like everyone else," Klaus said bitterly. "Everyone leaves. Everyone dies or disappears. My father, my brother, now you. Why should we have trusted you at all?" The other children watched the confrontation with wide eyes. Sullivan understood that Klaus wasn't just speaking for himself, he was voicing what all of them felt. The abandonment, the loss, the fear that anything good in their lives was temporary and conditional. "You're right," Sullivan said quietly. "I am leaving. And I'm asking you to do something incredibly unfair. To take what I taught you and keep going without me. To be the teacher for the next group of kids. To believe that what we've built here can survive my absence." He paused, looking at each child in turn. "I know it's unfair. I know you've already been asked to be stronger and braver than any children should have to be. But I'm asking anyway, because I believe you can do it. I believe you're already more than you think you are." Klaus's anger deflated slightly, replaced by something closer to despair. "I don't know how to be a coach. I don't know how to be what you were." "You don't have to be what I was," Sullivan countered. "You have to be what you are. You've already been teaching the younger kids, Klaus. You've already been leading. It doesn't stop just because I'm not here." Father Heinrich, who'd been standing at the edge of the shelter, stepped forward. "Lieutenant Sullivan, perhaps I could help. I know very little about baseball, but I know how to organize children and maintain structure. If Klaus and the others would teach me the game, I could provide the adult supervision." Herr Weber, also present, nodded. "I too will help. My playing days are long past, but I can keep score and ensure the field is maintained. The Phoenix will continue, Lieutenant." "You have my word." Sullivan felt a wave of gratitude. "Thank you. Both of you." He turned back to Klaus. "See? You won't be alone. The team will go on." Klaus was crying now, no longer bothering to hide it. "It won't be the same, no," Sullivan agreed. "It won't, but it will be something else. Something that belongs to you and your generation, not to mine. That's how it should be. We build the foundation, but you build the house." The practice that followed was subdued but determined. They worked on fundamentals, on the countless small skills that separated good players from great ones. Sullivan corrected stances and grips with special attention, knowing these were his final lessons. He wanted to leave them with everything he could. As the afternoon wore on, the rain finally stopped, and a weak sun broke through the clouds. Steam rose from the muddy field, creating an ethereal atmosphere. During a water break, Ernst and several other Kulmbach players arrived unexpectedly, having made the 15-mile journey to deliver a message. "We heard you're leaving," Ernst said to Sullivan. "We wanted to say thank you, and to promise Klaus that we'll keep playing, keep the rivalry going. The Phoenix and Tigers wheel make sure everyone remembers what you started." The two teams practiced together that afternoon, Germans from different towns, united by their shared love of an American game. They played until the light failed, until Sullivan finally called an end to it, knowing he needed to memorialize every detail of this moment. As the children dispersed into the evening, Klaus lingered. He approached Sullivan hesitantly, the anger from earlier replaced by sadness and something like understanding. "Coach," he said quietly, "I'm sorry I got angry. You didn't deserve that." "You had every right to be angry," Sullivan replied. "I'm sorry I'm leaving. If I could stay, I would. I know." Klaus pulled something from his pocket, the cross that had belonged to his brother Hans. He held it out to Sullivan. "I want you to have this, Klaus. No, that's too important." "That's your brother's. I know what it is," Klaus interrupted firmly. "My brother died in a war fighting for terrible things. But maybe if you take this, it can mean something different. Maybe it can represent what we built here instead. Peace instead of war. Friendship instead of hate." Sullivan's hands trembled as he accepted the cross. The silver was warm from Klaus's body heat. "I'll treasure this, Klaus. I promise. And I promise I'll keep the team going," Klaus said. "I'll teach the other kids everything you've taught me. The Phoenix will fly even without you." They embraced then. This American lieutenant and German boy in a bombed-out Bavarian town on a muddy baseball field, and for a moment the war and all its horrors seemed very far away. June 8th, 1945 broke clear and bright over Kronek, as if the weather itself wanted to provide a proper send-off. The 3rd Armored Division began its departure at 0800 hours, a long convoy of tanks, trucks, and support vehicles rolling south toward Austria. But one tank, the Cleveland Express, was delayed by an unauthorized stop in the town square. Lieutenant James Sullivan had received special permission from his battalion commander for a final goodbye. When his tank pulled into the square at 7:30, he found the entire town waiting. Not just the baseball team, but hundreds of residents, nearly the whole population, gathered to see off the American soldiers, who'd occupied their town for 8 weeks. It wasn't the typical occupier's farewell. There were tears, embraces, and genuine affection on both sides. Sullivan's crew had become part of Kronek's fabric. O'Brien had been teaching English classes. Davidson had helped repair the church organ. Chen had organized a youth gardening project. They'd been soldiers, yes, but they'd also been teachers, friends, and symbols of a different kind of America than the one that dropped bombs. The Kronok Phoenix stood together in their uniforms, which Maria Muller and other mothers had carefully cleaned and mended for this occasion. Klaus stood at the front, and when Sullivan climbed down from his tank, the boy stepped forward holding a carefully wrapped package. "We wanted to give you something to remember us by," Klaus said in English. His language skills had improved dramatically over the weeks. "Open it." Sullivan unwrapped the package carefully to find a baseball. But this wasn't just any ball. The leather had been painstakingly decorated with artwork. A phoenix rising from flames on one side, the American and German flags on the other, and surrounding it, the signatures of every child on the team in careful script. "We all signed it," Klaus explained, "so you wouldn't forget any of us. And so you could show people in America what happened here, that enemies became friends, that baseball can build bridges." Sullivan had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "I could never forget you. Any of you." He looked at the assembled team. "You took a game I taught you and made it mean something more than I imagined. We're the real coaches now, the real builders." Herr Weber stepped forward, leaning on his crutch. "Lieutenant, I was wrong about you. When you first arrived with your baseball and your idealism, I thought you were naive. I thought the hatred ran too deep, the wounds were too fresh. But you proved that even in the darkest times, there are still people willing to plant seeds instead of salt. You are a true educator, and Germany needs more like you." Father Heinrich offered a blessing, asking God to protect Sullivan on his journey, and to watch over the bonds that had been forged in Cronach. Then, to Sullivan's surprise, the children began to sing a song they'd learned from one of the American soldiers. "Take me out to the ball game," rendered in accented English with touching earnestness. The Stars and Stripes correspondent Corporal Brennan, present to document the 3rd Armored's departure, captured it all on film. Years later, he would write in his memoir that it was the most moving moment he'd witnessed in 3 years of covering the war, more than the liberation of concentration camps, more than victory celebrations, more than any battlefield heroism. Because this was about hope rather than horror, about what comes after rather than what was lost. As the time came for Sullivan to leave, Klaus approached one final time. They stood facing each other, this 20-year-old teacher from Cleveland and this 11-year-old boy from Bavaria, who'd been shaped by forces beyond either of their control. "Will you come back?" Klaus asked. "Someday. I hope so," Sullivan said honestly. "When things are more settled. When Germany has rebuilt. I'd like to see what you've done with the team. See the kind of man you become. I'll make you proud, Coach. You already have, Klaus. You all have." Sullivan climbed back onto the Cleveland Express. The tank's engine roared to life, and the convoy began to move. As they pulled away from the square, Sullivan stood in the commander's hatch and waved. The children ran alongside as long as they could, waving and shouting goodbyes until the tanks picked up speed and left them behind. Klaus stood in the square long after the convoy disappeared until his mother came and gently led him home. But the next day, he was back at the baseball field, organizing practice just as Sullivan had taught him. Ernst and the Kulmbach Tigers visited the following week. The rematch went ahead as planned. Tigers won 4-3 in extra innings, and both teams celebrated afterward. The Cronach Phoenix continued for years. Klaus remained its leader through his teenage years, eventually becoming a physical education teacher himself and founding a proper youth baseball league that spread throughout Bavaria. Ernst became a sports journalist and wrote extensively about the early days of German baseball. Peter Steiner became a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, crediting baseball with saving his life. Lieutenant James Sullivan returned home to Cleveland in August 1945. He resumed his teaching career and coached baseball until his retirement in 1978. He never forgot Cronach or the children who'd thrown rocks and learned to throw strikes instead. The signed baseball sat on his desk for the rest of his life. And he told the story to every class he taught, every team he coached. In 1962, 17 years after their first meeting, Klaus Muller traveled to Cleveland with his wife and young daughter. Sullivan, now a high school principal, welcomed them into his home. The two men embraced like the old friends they were, and spent 3 days talking about baseball, teaching, and the strange paths life takes. Klaus's daughter, named Maria after her grandmother, learned to throw a baseball in Sullivan's backyard, guided by both her father and the American hood started it all. "You know what I realized?" Klaus said on their final evening together. "That day you taught me baseball. You weren't just teaching me a game. You were teaching me that I had a choice. I could stay angry, stay trapped in what the war made me, or I could learn something new, become something different. That was the real lesson." "The real lesson," Sullivan replied, "is that you were always capable of that choice. I just gave you a reason to make it." They returned to Cronach together for a visit in 1975, the 30th anniversary of their meeting. The baseball field had been officially dedicated as Sullivan Field in a ceremony Klaus organized. The old diamond, now properly maintained with real bases and a backstop, hosted a youth league with over 200 children. Ernst came from Munich, where he worked as a sports editor. Other members of the original Phoenix traveled from across Germany. They gathered on the pitcher's mound, now elderly men. All of them and recreated the famous photograph from 1945. But this time, they were surrounded by a new generation, their children and grandchildren, all carrying forward a tradition born from a rock thrown in anger and transformed into something beautiful. Sullivan died in 1984 at the age of 67. Having lived long enough to see baseball become genuinely popular in Germany. With professional leagues and youth programs throughout the country, Klaus spoke at his funeral, traveling from Cronach to Cleveland to say goodbye to his coach one final time. "He taught me baseball," Klaus told the mourners. "But more importantly, he taught me that enemies are just friends you haven't met yet. That violence is a choice, not a destiny. That even in the darkest times, one person with a baseball and hope can change the world. My children learn this from me, and their children will learn it from them. Lieutenant James Sullivan's legacy isn't just measured in wins and losses, but in generations of people who learn to play instead of fight, to compete instead of kill, to build instead of destroy. The signed baseball from 1945 was donated to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, where it remains today in a special exhibit about baseball's role in post-war reconciliation. Next to it hangs the famous photograph of the Cronack Phoenix and Kulmbach Tigers on the pitcher's mound. Smiling children who'd survived a war learning to live in peace. And in Cronack, on a field now named for an American teacher who spent 8 weeks teaching baseball to German children, the game continues. New generations of Phoenix players learn to throw strikes, to catch fly balls, to steal bases, and slide home safely. They wear the same Phoenix logo on their jerseys, and before every game, they observe a moment of silence to remember where it all began, with one angry boy, one patient soldier, and a baseball that crossed the divide between enemies and transformed them into teammates. The rock Klaus threw at that American tank on April 12, 1945, was an act of war. The baseball Sullivan threw back was an act of peace. In the end, the baseball won not because it was stronger, but because it represented something the war never could: the promise that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. That children could transcend their parents' conflicts, and that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is not destroy, but build. That is the story of how a German boy threw a rock at an American tank, and the commander taught him baseball instead. It's a story about war and peace, about hatred and friendship, about the power of one person to change the trajectory of another's life. But most of all, it's a story about hope, the kind of hope that survives even the darkest times, that grows in the ruins of destroyed cities, that transforms enemies into friends and soldiers into teachers.